Australian cities are seeing an infrastructure boom with lots of new rolling stock on order too. Ironically, none of this is from Australian rolling stock manufacturers who have all but left the field. As late as 2010, nearly all rolling stock operating in Australia was locally designed and manufactured, but this is now the exception rather than the rule. Why is this? Based on my observations over 30 odd years in rolling stock design and manufacture, this is what I think happened. The catalogue of rolling stock designed and built in Australia is vast and varied. The mainland capital cities all have fleets of electric multiple units, and excepting Melbourne, these were nearly all designed and built in Australia until around 2010. Outside the capital cities, the DMUs operating regional services and the locomotive-hauled interstate trains are still all locally designed and built. In 2010, almost all freight trains were hauled by diesel-electric locomotives designed and built by Downer or UGL. These Australian companies had license agreements with US giants EMD and GE respectively, and integrated US traction systems into locomotives designed for our smaller outlines and lower axle loads. Until about 2005, most freight wagons were also locally designed and manufactured. The wagon building business saw many entrants and many exits, but until quite recently, Bradken and UGL were dominant. Some history. In 1985, Comenge was the largest Australian rolling stock manufacturer and was delivering a 570-car EMU order for Melbourne, yet it was soon to disappear. Comenge had supplied all of Sydney's double-deck trains after displacing Tulloch, whose pioneering double-deck trailers were delivered in the 1960s. In 1978, Newcastle-based A. Ginninan won its first double-deck order, taking a big slice of the market from Comenge. In 1986, Ginninan was awarded the New South Wales Tangara project for 450 cars. This was a blow from which Comenge never recovered. And although continuing to build interurban trains for New South Wales and completing a number of other projects, including trams, electric locomotives, and even the ski tube for the New South Wales snowfields, it closed the gate after delivering the last interurban in 1989. In the Queensland town of Maryborough, Walker started building EMUs for the newly electrified Brisbane network in 1979. Further orders for Brisbane followed, and later for Perth after electrification there in 1991. Walker's remained the sole supplier to Perth until last year. Clyde Engineering was the dominant locomotive builder for decades, and the 1980s were mostly good years, with 335 diesel-electric locomotives delivered to New Zealand, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia and Australian National. But the decade ended with a 2-year order drought and plant closures. In summary, there were too many players. Each enjoyed what amounted to a near monopoly in one corner of the market, but to grow or even just maintain continuity of production, they needed to break into their competitors' territory. The occasional success of a new player was a major blow for the incumbent in any sector. Walker's and Ginninan's gains made Comenge's position precarious. With a hiatus in new orders across the country, Comenge's new orders ANI chose to quit, selling the new factory in Dandenong to the European multinational ABB. Similarly, Ginninan's partnership with GE broke Clyde's monopoly in diesel locomotives, resulting in a first near-death experience with no new designs or new builds from 1989 to 91. Clyde survived after winning orders for 50 diesel railcars for Adelaide and 15 electric locomotives for Queensland, both of which were extension orders for products made by the now-departed Comenge. Winning the Power by the Hour contract for New South Wales Freight Corp in 1992 to supply and maintain 89 locomotives, the 82 class and the 90 class, saw Clyde back on top of its core business. But the loss to Ginninan of a 50 locomotive order for Queensland, the 2800 class in 1995, followed by a big order for 120 NR class locomotives for the newly formed National Rail in 1996, saw Clyde back in survival mode with more layoffs. Ginninan's dominance was challenged when Evans Deakin Industries, who already owned Walker's, bought Clyde in 1996. Walker's main customers were the narrow gauge operators in Queensland and Perth. The amalgamated company could compete across the whole of Australia. This appeared to have paid off when Clyde won contracts to build the fourth generation double-deck electric trains for New South Wales in 1998, and also the first locomotives with AC traction for Queensland. The much weakened Ginninan became ripe for takeover and was bought by the United Group in 1999. The combined Clyde Walkers Group became EDI Rail in 2000, just as the Millennium Train contract was encountering headwinds. Clyde had bravely taken on the role of prime contractor after their international partner Alstom withdrew when the number of cars in the project was reduced. EDI merged with Downer in March 2001, but the New South Wales government did not proceed with the third tranche of the Millenniums and instead went to tender for outer suburban cars. This contract was awarded to UGL in 2003. The initial order was for a loss-making 10 four-car sets, but subsequent orders over the next 8 years took the total to 55 sets. Maintaining continuity of work was a problem for both the major players. After completing the Tangara and then the NR locomotive projects, Ginninan UGL was in survival mode. After 2003, the pendulum swung the other way with the OSC, and Downer had to slash its workforce. Mining activity began to accelerate around 2005, benefiting both Downer and UGL. Initially, there were small orders for US-built locos for Pilbara iron ore, but orders continued to flow, especially in Queensland. At the same time, QR National broke into New South Wales coal haulage, ordering 12 5000 class locomotives from UGL. In late 2005, Downer also won a contract to design and build a new diesel locomotive with AC traction for SCT, an intermodal transport company with ambitions to operate in all states. At 15 locomotives, the order was relatively small, but had the promise of sales to other customers after the hard work of initial development. UGL won the next order for mainline locomotives, with 15 for Pacific National, which entered service in 2008. As coal and iron ore mines expanded around Australia, both Downer and UGL built locomotives almost continuously for 7 years. UGL eventually produced 155 of their C44 ACI, while Downer produced 79 of their equivalent mainline loco. In Queensland, Downer enjoyed a virtual monopoly and produced a total of 194 narrow gauge AC locos, introduced in 2000, but in continuous production after 2005. In total, Downer built 245 locomotives between 2003 and 2011. But boom ended in bust, with the last of these locomotives not finding buyers until 2015. When SCT and PN began to buy locomotives from China at half the price, Downer tapped the mat and ended a 60-year relationship with EMD, which had in the meantime been bought by Progress Rail. Progress Rail moved manufacturing back to the USA, but initially retained a local design team. This has now been disbanded. Since the end of the boom, the sole surviving locomotive designer and builder, UGL, has received a few single-digit orders. UGL also continues to design bogies for non-standard applications, previously for its partner GE's international customers, and more recently for Toshiba, with 140 bogies for Taiwan. In 2005, Bradken's Ipswich facility celebrated building its 2000th iron ore wagon for the Pilbara. But to remain competitive against an increasing flow of imports, both UGL and Bradken moved their production offshore. In 2008, Bradken still held about 40% of market share and opened a plant in Zhuzhou. By 2017, Bradken had left the wagon market and is now owned by Hitachi Industrial Machinery. Similarly, UGL formed a joint venture with Texmeco and moved wagon production to India in 2011. The demise of our wagon manufacturing appears to have caused more concern in the USA than locally. The graphic for wagon production is taken from a report commissioned by the US industry from Oxford Economics. By around 2010, it was clear we had passed the tipping point. Since then, there's only been a trickle of small repeat orders for rail cars built in Australia, with all the big orders either being wholly constructed overseas or in some cases with some local assembly when mandated. There had been no investment in rolling stock in Victoria for a decade when the Victorian government franchised its rail operations in 1999. After milking local industry in the tender process, National Express and Connex awarded large EMU contracts to Siemens and Alstom respectively. These were designed and initially built overseas, although after the first 10 sets, Alstom localised fit out in Ballarat. The Waratah double-deck train contract, awarded to Downer in 2006, was a watershed for the Australian industry. It was the largest ever order in Australia, with 626 cars, and the New South Wales government only required 20% local content. The rate of delivery would have required more than doubling Downer's existing capacity. Although locally designed, the cars were mostly completed in China. They were finished at Downer's Cardiff facility, but a huge amount of unplanned rework was required. The project encountered numerous difficulties, with losses approaching $500 million, absorbing most of the windfall profits made by Downer's other divisions during the resources boom. The cars entered service in 2011 to 14, but Downer's board received a clear message from institutional investors regarding the risk profile of future contracts. The initial order was followed by another 24 sets, delivered in 2018-19, but these were fully completed in China, with CRRC rather than Downer as prime contractor. Downer's interest is in the long-term maintenance, which provides predictable, steady income. CRRC is currently supplying another 17 sets from China. The first 5 sets are already in service. UGL took a similar path for the New South Wales New Interurban fleet, awarded in 2016. This is a big order for 554 cars. Although based on the OSC, the new trains are being designed and built in Korea, with Rotem as a prime contractor. The first sets arrived at the end of 2019, and they should soon enter service. In Sydney, the government is committed to a new metro network with driverless trains, separated from the existing rail network. The first section opened in 2019, running from the northwest and joining the existing Epping to Chatswood line. Although incorporating brownfield tracks, the tunnels are too small to accommodate the standard Plate A rolling stock outline, and hence to accommodate double-deck trains. The EMUs running on this system were designed overseas by Alstom and were built in India. In 2019, the New South Wales government chose an overseas entrant when awarding a contract for new regional trains consisting of 117 cars to replace the ageing XPT long-distance trains and the Explorer and Endeavour DMUs. Due to enter service in 2023, these will be designed and built in Europe by the Spanish company CAF. Before 2018, all of Brisbane's previous EMUs were built in Downer's Maryborough plant, but the NGR trains, consisting of 450 cars, were built in India. Nevertheless, much of the design work was performed by Bombardier in Australia. In Melbourne, the high-capacity metro train, HCMT project, for 65 7-car trains was awarded to a consortium with CRRC in 2016. These are designed and partially built in China, but the Victorian government mandated 50% local content. The cars are fitted out at Newport, and local industry supplying bogie frames and air conditioning units. In Perth, where all previous EMU stock had been supplied from Maryborough, the PTA awarded a contract for 41 6-car sets to Alstom in 2019. These will be an international design with body shells constructed in India. There is a local content requirement, with the cars being fitted out in Perth in a new facility, which after the construction phase will become the maintenance facility. While the government attempts to include local content are laudable, state preference does not help sustain a national industry. There is no advantage for an Australian car builder trying to maintain continuity of work in a specialised factory in another state. The ad hoc facilities being used for fit-out to meet state government local content requirements are not intended to be used for manufacture after the existing contracts are completed. History shows that the Australian market can barely sustain 2 local manufacturers. With all of the recent contracts being awarded to international players, both Downer and UGL have ceased to manufacture locally. Component suppliers have also seen greatly reduced demand for their products. Comsteel has made forged wheels and axles in Newcastle for more than a century. Most new rolling stock is imported and comes with wheels and axles. However, when local content is mandated, it usually favours local manufacture of bogies, which does help Comsteel. The remaining local demand is replacing wheels, which, fortunately for ComSteel, wear out several times during the life of a vehicle. Axles, however, are rarely replaced. ComSteel's neighbour Bradken fared worse, as already described. Bradford Kendall made castings such as couplers and bogie frames for 100 years. This work has ceased. Sigma Air Conditioning's history starts in the 1960s. Although never enjoying a monopoly, Sigma has provided more than half of the air conditioning units on all rail vehicles in Australia. To remain competitive, Sigma moved manufacturing overseas in 2003. Ownership changed several times, with Knorr-Bremse purchasing the company in 2010. On the positive side, the local content requirements for Melbourne's HCMT have seen a return to local manufacture. Many of the job losses in rail manufacturing are from regional areas. Bradken, ComSteel, Downer, UGL, and many sub-suppliers manufactured in the Hunter Valley north of Sydney. The respective workforces of these companies are now a shadow of what they were. Clyde, Comenge, and Gunninan all opened facilities in regional areas in the 1970s. These have all closed recently. And yet, these all saw major work. For example, the Clyde facility in Bathurst made the motors and other electrical equipment for the stainless steel Clyde Hitachi cars, which replaced Melbourne's wooden-bodied Tate trains. It made 900 traction motors for the Tangara fleet and built 115 locomotives. It closed in 2014. Australian productivity was low in the days of high levels of protection. After tariffs were wound back from the time of the Hawke government onwards, our industry did lift its game, with an increasing emphasis on efficiency, productivity, and quality. In the early 1990s, there was a focus on TQM, just-in-time, and other techniques used in Japanese industry. Just as the quality of cars improved greatly as Ford and Holden tried to catch up with Toyota, the rolling stock industry also made gains. Cellular, manufacture, and computer-aided management systems were introduced. There was a concerted effort to bring costs down in accordance with market demands. But by the early 2000s, a different message was emerging. In an MBA course, I was told there was already sufficient production capacity in China and South Korea. Instead of wasting our energy metal bashing, we should instead focus on the smarts, like brand management and design in the fashion sense. Within a decade, this had become a reality. Australian industry has not been without innovation. The Tulloch aluminium double-deck cars of the 1960s were world-leading. Comenge then produced fully double-deck trains, and Sydney had a significant double-deck fleet ahead of Europe or Japan. We have seen high-speed tilting trains on narrow gauge in Queensland and the early introduction of AC traction in heavy haul on narrow gauge. We have seen single airbag bogies on double-deck cars and steering bogies on locomotives. But the operators have shown a willingness to favour overseas suppliers when price is substantially lower. With too many suppliers and an uneven flow of orders, the cycle of ramping up for a new contract with little or no revenue until the beginning of deliveries and then mass layoffs at the end has been all too frequent. Unless the profit margins are high, it is just not worth doing. Yet the struggle for survival meant high-risk contracts were sometimes entered with single-digit margins. Unit prices fall as the size of an order increases, and billion-dollar contracts favour the internationals, who are less constrained by capacity and can balance fluctuating workloads using countries with low wages. Meanwhile, Australian competition rules prevent local manufacturers from colluding to smooth the workflow. Having a trained workforce in a specialised facility in the wrong state can be a liability. There has been no new construction in Maryborough since the last train left for Perth in 2019, and Downer is now focused on refurbishment, modification and maintenance work. It is much the same at UGL since the 2016 takeover by the largely European-owned CIMIC Group, except for the small number of locomotives built. This leaves Bombardier, which has been producing Velocity DMU since 2004 in its Dandenong plant, as the only other local manufacturer of locally designed vehicles. We wait to see how the acquisition of Bombardier by Alstom will play out. While the internationals have taken all the high-value contracts, smaller orders are of little interest to them. There may be no one willing to do these when they arise. The capacity to build rolling stock still exists in Australia, and we still have a pool of people with skills in design and manufacturing. Unless it is utilised very soon, it'll disappear. I hope this is not the end.